Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this lecture by the Cañada Blanch Center at the LSE with Lewis Dijkstra. It's my great pleasure to have Lewis Dijkstra here, who's going to be talking about regional disparities in the European Union, all problems and new challenges. And this cannot be more timely because Lewis is the editor of the Cohesion Report, a fundamental report that appears traditionally every 3 years, has been a bit delayed this year because of the pandemic, but is one that provides the states of cities and regions in Europe and is the fundamental piece to inform policymakers and decision makers about regional development policies. Lewis is the head of the economic analysis sector of the Directorate General for Regional and Urban Policy in the European Commission. He is, as I said before, the editor of the Cohesion Report, which analyzes economic, social, and environmental issues in EU regions and cities. And he is also a visiting professor every once in a while at the London School of Economics, although the pandemic has prevented him from coming to London in the last 2 years. And we hope to see you here very, very soon. He works not just in the European Commission. He has a close working relationship with a lot of international bodies, especially the OECD, but also quite a few UN agencies, the World Bank, the European Environmental Agency, and the Joint Research Center in Seville and Eurostat. He's also a prolific scientist, not just a civil servant, and one that informs policy for that. And he has covered topics that include the new global definition of what are cities and what are rural areas that has been accepted by the UN. He has been pioneering in measures, he has been pioneering on the geography of EU discontent, and he has been working quite a lot on issues of quality of government and gender equality. I must say that in terms of quality of government against all odds, he actually push researchers and encourage researchers to drive measuring quality of government that has led in this decade to probably one of the most innovative type of research in regional development that we have witnessed for quite some time. In terms of background, he holds a PhD in urban and regional planning from Rutgers University in New Jersey, and an MSc in urban and regional planning from the London School of Economics and Political Science, and a BA in political science from the University of Ghent. He's going to be talking for about 40 to 50 minutes, and then there will be time for you to ask questions. I would appreciate if everyone can mute themselves while we are doing the presentations, and you can place your questions in the chat below. And once they're placed, I will highlight those questions and I will let you in so you can ask the questions directly to Lewis. So without further ado, Lewis, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andrés. I now will attempt the impossible to share my screen, and then I will present the impossible, which is a 300+ pages cohesion report in under an hour. But it is my great pleasure to do so, and I'm really delighted that I'll be able to talk you through some of the main conclusions. It's also a very big pleasure to do this at LSE, because there's been several researchers at LSE, not just Andrés, who have contributed to the analysis that we try and summarize here in this cohesion report. Okay, let's sit down, buckle up, and let's enjoy the ride. So, the Age Cohesion Report. What is this all about? Why do we do this? Let me see, why does this not move? Yeah. So, why do we do this? What is this all about? So, we want to report to the EU and its institutions, but and its citizens and its voters about the state of EU regions, cities, and rural areas. This time round, we have an additional chapter, unfortunate chapter on COVID, a chapter I hope we can close soon, but we haven't fully closed yet. And then we have a number of chapters focusing on the new policy objectives of cohesion policy for a smarter, a greener, a more connected, a more social Europe, and one closer to its citizens. Then we look at the issues of better governance, and there Andrés has been doing a lot of work, and we've been really pushing, as he was mentioned, using governance indicators to understand the impact on issues as diverse as innovation, migration, and entrepreneurship. Then we look briefly at the impact of national policies and the impact of cohesion policy. And to wrap this all up, we have a communication, which is the bit which is formally adopted by the Commission, and it looks at, so it summarizes the report and highlights some of the key future challenges to cohesion, and in particular for cohesion policy. So, COVID, very unexpected, and indeed we wanted to not ignore this. This is also why it's the first chapter here. We really wanted to look at this because obviously the first thing people think about is the health impact. We've been living with this pandemic for almost 2 years now, and it has really led to a massive rise, very big, sharp spikes of excess mortality, leading to heavy burdens on the healthcare and hospitals in a particular region. And Madrid and Milan were among the first few areas in Europe to really experience this surge of infections. But if you look on the graph on the left-hand side, you'll see that those southern regions experienced the first real big peak or wave, if you will, but it was in the eastern regions of the EU that we saw the highest peaks in the second and in the third wave. So while it started in Southern Europe, it moved to Eastern Europe and with a vengeance. Because if you look at the map, you can see that the highest excess mortality overall since the beginning of the pandemic, so since March 2020, and here's data until almost the end of 2021, you see that there's a much higher level of excess mortality in Eastern Europe. And this is for many reasons, but one of them is the low vaccination uptake. And here you can see the best data we can find on vaccination and uptake up until November 2021. And you can see many regions in Eastern Europe where the uptake is very, very low. So, regions where less than 20% of the population has received a double shot of vaccinations. Now, why are vaccine uptake so low? It's a very complicated story. I'm not going to do it full justice, and there are much more research out there on this, but couple of things that seem to play an important role. One is trust. If there's low trust in government or low trust in science or low trust in the healthcare system, this may lead to reluctance for people to accept taking a vaccine. It might be that distance plays a role in rural areas, but there's also a cultural dimension. In large cities, you have multilingual population, so who may not read the mainstream news or the news in one of the main languages of the region, and so are harder to reach. Also, if you have a large migrant population, they may not be as familiar with the healthcare system, so that poses some challenges. And if you look, for example, in France, you can see some of the areas around Paris have a relatively low uptake, and also Brussels, the city where I live, has a relatively low uptake of the vaccines. So what did we do? We buckled down, we locked down, we shut down, and one of the things we shut down was travel. International travel restrictions went into effect very, very rapidly. Here you can see the Oxford Blavatnik School index of travel restrictions for all the EU member states, and we've grouped them into southern, eastern, and northwestern member states. And the differences between the three groups aren't that big. Eastern might be slightly less restricted than the rest, but very similar. We ramped it up, which killed off so much of international travel, and especially tourism. And that was one of the sectors most affected by this pandemic. And so we tried to estimate which regions, that's 3 regions here on the right, are most vulnerable to a reduction of tourism activity. And so here we can clearly see that the Mediterranean coast is very popular, but also the ski resorts in Austria. They have a very high number of tourism visits per inhabitant. They have a very high seasonality to it as well. So if they miss the season, they miss the biggest revenue of the year. And so there you can see these areas are highly concentrated. On the left-hand side, we see a graph where we're looking at the tourism nights per resident. So this kind of gives you an indication how important is that tourism economy for a particular country. No surprises here: Cyprus, Malta, Croatia, Greece, Spain, Austria, Portugal, Italy. very important tourism destinations, and so you have many visitors there. But these are also exactly the countries where we see the biggest relative reduction in the number of nights. So the red little stripes are on the right-hand axis, and that's negative. So the further higher up you are, the bigger the reduction you are. And you can see it between 2019, when it was very high, to 2020, when it dropped off massively. Looking at the economic impact at the regional level is hard. We're still waiting for the next release of regional GDP from 2020, which will come in a few weeks from Eurostat. But until that, we couldn't actually measure the impact on GDP. We looked at the impact on the change in hours worked. I think that's a better measure, because all the job retention scheme fortunately meant that actually employment rates didn't drop as much, and unemployment didn't skyrocket like it did briefly in the USA. But here you see two sources. They use slightly different definition of hours worked. It's the labor force survey, suggesting that hours worked in the EU dropped by 12% between 2019 and 2020, and national accounts suggesting it dropped by 6%. But they all agree that Greece, Spain, Portugal, Italy were among some of the most effective member states in terms of reductions of hours worked between those 2 years. On the right-hand side, you can see the labor force survey data on where you see big reductions in the hours worked, and you can clearly see that, tourism destinations like the Algarve or the Mediterranean coast in Spain and Italy and Greece were heavily affected by the pandemic. National accounts gives us some indication of how, at least at the national level, the impact has been, and it has been the biggest post-war recession ever. But the very sharp drop in 2020 was also overcome to a large degree in 2021. Not in all member states, but you see a big drop in 2020, and we expect a big boost in 2021. These are still preliminary figures to be confirmed, but we definitely saw a big resurgence again in 2021. But again, not all countries were affected equally, and here on the map we have used our Romulo, our regional economic model, to simulate the impact of that pandemic for 2020, and there you see the reductions in GDP that we estimate relative to the baseline in 2020. Again, Croatia, Italy, Greece, Spain are among some of the most affected regions there. So that was the COVID chapter. We're now moving on to the SMART chapter, looking at the economic impact. And here we see we take a look at a 20-year time period. On the left-hand side, you see the category of regions that we use for cohesion policy in 2021-27. So 3 classes: less developed, transition, more developed. And in the report, you'll see a lot of data aggregated by these categories. And I forgot to mention, one of the headlines picked up by the newspapers from the cohesion report was that excess mortality was considerably higher in less developed regions, 17% compared to only 11% in more developed regions. So all those regions in red really saw a lot more excess mortality, the ones in kind of yellow. So you get the GDP per capita for 2019. That's what we use. Well, we use a 3-year average to classify the less developed regions. But then if you look at the growth rates over that period, you actually see that some regions over that 20-year time period didn't see an increase in real GDP per capita. So quite a few, most of the regions in Italy and Greece, but also a few regions in France actually saw a reduction over that period. This is not relative decline, this is absolute decline per capita. So that's really quite tough. Looking at 3 clear periods to understand this process, you can actually see that. So for some countries, they've never done particularly well. And Italy, even before the economic crisis hit, quite a few regions were already suffering from an economic reduction. And then, of course, the crisis hit them incredibly hard. And the recovery since 2014 was relatively uneven. It really didn't help the Italian regions that much. You can see in the East, high growth rates, more than 2.5% before the crisis. A varied impact of the crisis, Poland actually not experiencing a recession, but some places, notably in Romania, hit a bit harder in Slovenia and Croatia, but then a big bounce back, you know, again, very high growth rates since that economic crisis before the one induced by the pandemic. And this has some consequences for convergence. We've got the good news that the less developed regions have been converging to the EU average, but that the transition regions, the ones in yellow on the left here, were actually diverging over that time. This is GDP per head relative to the EU average. And so you can see that yellow line slowly moving down, and even the pandemic, the economic crisis in 2008, you can see a little impact, but it hasn't really stopped that relative decline. Looking at NUTS 3 regions classified according to urban-rural classification and including remoteness, we actually see a convergence of rural regions, predominantly rural regions, but only for the ones close to a city. If you look at the ones which are remote, so far away from a city, and this is also true for intermediate remote regions, you actually see a divergence. So really you see the importance of being close to at least a city nearby. The urban regions actually have been convergent, but from above rather than from below. So we wanted to look at development traps, because one of the explanations the Cohesion Report talks about is the fact that some of these transition regions, these middle income regions, but also some of the less developed regions may actually be stuck in a development trap. This is something we developed together with Andrés and Simone at LSE. And let me try and explain very briefly how we did it. So basically we look at the growth in a region. We take a 5-year average and we look at 3 types of growth: GDP per head growth, labor productivity growth, and employment growth. And for those 3 types of growth, we compare it to 3 geographical regions: the EU, the member state for the same period, both, or the 5-year period preceding the 5-year average we've just calculated for the same region. And if in the majority of cases a region has a lower growth, you know, relative to these other groups, we classify it as trapped. And then you get this map. We look at the GDP per capita in 2000, and then we look at how often they were trapped. If they were trapped less than half of the time, we consider them as mostly not trapped. If they were trapped at least 10 years, then they're mostly trapped. And then the darkest colors, the dark red, dark brown, dark green, those are what we call frequently trapped. There's lots I can say about this map, but I really try and be telegraphic. So the main point is very few of the less developed regions were trapped, but quite a few that were in that category between 75 and 100% in 2000 are trapped. And so you see quite a few dark brown and quite a few dark green as well. And looking at those frequently trapped regions, they have a number of characteristics in common. They tend to have a less educated labor force. They tend to have lower investments in R&D. They have lower quality institutions and a smaller manufacturing sector. So really, these are a number of characteristics that we need to address if we want to fix this development trap, allow regions to escape from this. And one of the worrying things here is that over time, over the past 5 years, we've actually seen a growing innovation divide. So the more developed regions have become more innovative, whereas the less developed and the transition regions have become less innovative. This is the Regional Innovation Scoreboard produced by Hugo Hollanders and his colleagues at the University of Maastricht. And so you get a very detailed classification of innovativeness, and the dark blue is the best and the dark brown is euphemistically called the emerging innovators, but it really means the least innovative category here. And so if you look at the graph on the left, you see that in 2016, quite a few less developed regions and transition regions were not classified in this lowest class, this emerging innovator class. But by 2021, you know, the vast majority of less developed regions and a growing share of transition regions were either classified as emerging or moderate, so the 2 lowest classes. So this growing innovation divide gives us reason for concern that this might undermine long-term growth rate, long-term convergence for those regions. So that was the smarter chapter. Let's keep barreling on. So we have a green chapter looking at reducing greenhouse gas emissions. This is our our biggest ambition, our biggest challenge to become carbon neutral by 2050. I'm proud of the Union for leading the way and encouraging other countries to follow suit. We had an ambitious target for 2020. We don't have the final data yet, but it looks like we'll achieve that reduction to -20%. We have an even far more ambitious target for 2030 and a much shorter time frame, a reduction to -55 relative to 1990. So that will require massive actions of all actors in all regions in the Union. And it's really critical that we, make sure that we make that transition and that that transition is fair and that it leaves nobody behind. Here in this map, you can see that in some regions, the ones in purple, actually emissions increased per capita, total emissions increased over that time period between 1990 and 2018. That might be because of new manufacturing activity or economic growth, but it's clear that we all need to go to a situation where we reduce these emissions and do so much faster than we have been doing so far. We also have the ambition to reduce our energy consumption. If you look on the left-hand graph, you can see quite a few countries haven't reached their target yet, and we're trying to increase those targets. The renewable energy, also quite a bit of progress, but a lot more progress to be made. We're hoping to reach 20% of renewable energy for 2020. Looks like we'll get there. This is data for 2018 I'm showing, but then the ambition for 2030 is to increase that, to double that to 40%. So again, we will need to make big changes faster than ever before. And the last sector I want to mention here is the transport sector. This is a difficult sector where we have made virtually no progress in the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, and also to become that carbon neutral continent, we need to make sure that also that sector decarbonizes and does so rapidly. And why? Well, allowing climate change to continue would have dramatic impacts for the Union. We would see a rapid increase in the amount of heat waves, big impacts you can see there on the left-hand side for Spain, but also in some areas of Greece and Croatia and France. You'd see a very, very high increase in the number of heat waves. You'd get damages to infrastructure because of those floods, but also just general economic damages. We've had horrible news here in Brussels, in Belgium, but also in Germany and the Netherlands of big floods last summer. And these are going to become the new normal, the more and more frequent. So we really need to avert that catastrophe. And that's why we need to work so hard to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Looking at the other aspects of the green transition, I have some better news. We are getting better in treating urban wastewater. We're getting to reduce air pollution and we're protecting soils more, but there is still a lot that needs to be done. On the map on the left, you can see many regions we're still not even treating half the wastewater produced. And so there, more investments will be needed to make sure that we protect the health of the environment and our water systems. Particulate matter, the really fine particles, 2.5, have a big impact on life expectancy, and they lead to unnecessary loss of life. And here you can see that in Romania, Bulgaria, and large chunks of Poland, you see a lot of years' life lost due to air pollution. So that's something we need to address. And then the last map is kind of inspired by the Sustainable Development Goals. We're looking at the imperviousness per capita to see where people have a lot of land covered with asphalt or buildings and where we don't. And you can kind of see some interesting patterns there. If you look very closely, like at Madrid or Paris or Berlin, you see that big cities tend to not use a lot of land per capita. But you can also see the big trends. You can see Poland and Romania also don't use generally as much land as, say, France or Finland or Sweden. There's a component there of economic development as well. Looking at Connected Europe, seeing at how we can reduce emissions by shifting to rail. It's a big topic. here on the left, we've looked at the connection between major cities in Europe and looking how quickly they are. And well, generally, if it's within a large country, they might be fast. As soon as they cross a national border, speeds tend to drop. It's much harder to ensure that fast connection. As you can see in Italy, you've got a lot of fast connections with Italy, but the connections to France are much slower. This is also in part because you've got the Alps in between, so there is also a physical reason for those slower connections. But we actually did the math, and on average, rail connections across national borders are slower than the ones that stay within the same country. But what we really wanted to know is, when can rail offer a competitive alternative, pure in terms of time, not in terms of cost, and time spent traveling relative to air flights, direct flights. And so here we looked in two ways. We looked at the distance between the cities, and we see that especially for shorter distances, rail often has the competitive advantage. So, you know, for cities that are only 100K apart, it's much better to take the train. 200, still better. And as soon as you hit 500, it becomes 500, becomes very hard to really have the same speed as air travel would. But in some cases, all those dots are cities. City pairs, but in some cases, rail still offers a competitive alternative over such a long distance. So the dots above the line show the city pairs where the train is faster than the airplane to get a city center to city center connection. And what's driving that? It's speed. You know, if rail is really fast, it's much more likely to offer a competitive advantage or a competitive alternative to air flights, as you can see in the bottom graph. You know, the faster the train is, the more likely it is to be faster to travel by rail than by air. We've also been using a new indicator where we look at transport performance. It's a relatively simple concept where we look at the population that lives within 120K radius of a single grid cell, and then we look what population you can reach by traveling an hour and a half, either by car or by rail. And here you can see those two maps showing the results. For road transport, you can clearly see in eastern parts, the performance is much lower, and this is true both in urban and rural settings. And generally, urban environments tend to do better because of the radial nature of the high-speed road network. That's even more true for rail. It primarily serves cities and smaller towns and their surrounding suburbs. And there you can clearly see all the major conurbations, especially in Western Europe, do quite well, whereas in Eastern Europe, many of the rail connections are relatively slow, relatively infrequent, and don't allow for rapid transport here. In terms of public transport, most of our cities do quite well, with a lot of public transport stops close to the population in the cities, as you can see on the right-hand map. But it's not because you get to the stop that you have a high speed or a high frequency connection, and that's something we dig into in the report itself. One important thing, something I'm a big believer in, we want to reduce traffic fatalities. I think there's too many lives shortened or harmed on our roads, and I think we really need to dramatically improve that, and we can, because we also have some of the safest countries and cities in the world. So we have the knowledge and expertise, but we just need to make sure that we all use this to make sure that getting from A to B doesn't lead to unnecessary injuries or lives lost. And so we have that goal of a 50% reduction. We can translate that into an absolute rate, and that's what we use to color code both maps. Now, what's the main takeaway? The regions that are green are typically large urban regions with a big city, but very few regions have reached that low level of traffic fatalities that we want to reach. Whereas at the city level, on the map on the right, you see far more green. Many cities actually have reached already a fairly low level of traffic fatalities per capita. And that's in part because it's very difficult to go very fast in the city. There's too many intersections, there's too much traffic, and slower traffic actually means less accidents, less injuries. And so some cities even move to go citywide to 30-kilometer speed restrictions like Brussels, and that really generally tends to help. But you need to change many things if you want to improve traffic safety. It's not just about the infrastructure, although they can help. It's also about drivers' education, changing laws, like changing speed limits and enforcing those speed limits, and ultimately changing behavior that we're collectively much safer than we were in the past. Here, there is a different kind of speed, and the speed that we can all engage in much more safely, and that's broadband. We've looked with UCLA data at the speed generally being tested by municipality, and here we see that in cities virtually everywhere in Europe, you can get a speed of at least 30 Mbps, megabytes per second. Looking at higher speeds, 100 Mbps, which is really quite nice if you're doing a lot of remote working like I am today, it becomes quite a bit rare. Only, say, 2 out of 3 city residents have that kind of speed in Europe, but for rural areas, only 1 out of 6. So that's really very, very low. And it, of course, limits the type of jobs they can do there, the kind of services they can access. And we really have the ambition to make sure that everybody can access this type of very high-speed internet, either through a fixed or a mobile connection. I mentioned it earlier, employment has recovered from, well, I mentioned that the impact of the COVID pandemic on employment was relatively restrained, and we've actually recovered from the economic crisis in 2008. Employment rates in 2019 and 2020 have been higher than they've ever been before in the Union, but big disparities still remain. And so regional disparities in the labor market have been starting to fall from the post-crisis high, but they're still higher than they were in 2007. So we haven't fully reduced those regional disparities. And if you look at the map on the left, you can really see big gaps there. The dark blue regions have an employment rate below 66%, whereas the darkest green ones, it's above 82% of the population aged 20-64. So big gaps. And that gap between less developed and more developed regions has remained at 10 percentage points for the past decade. So that's a real area of concern, that we're not managing to reduce those big labor market gaps. The unemployment rate has not been dramatically affected by COVID, and that's in large part due to the job retention schemes. But if you look at the situation in 2020, you see higher rates in some regions in Spain, Italy, and Greece, but primarily unemployment rates are relatively low. We do have the ambition to reduce the share of early leavers from education and training. So this is a population 18-24 that didn't finish high school and is not in training. And so here we really want to get that below 10%. In all the regions in green, we've reached that, but in the regions in purple, we still need to work on that quite a bit more. And here, for example, in Romania and Bulgaria, you can also see the urban-rural dimension, that this is easier to achieve in the capital than it is in the rest of the country. We have a complicated indicator called the at-risk of poverty or social exclusion. It is a mix of 3 underlying indicators, and that we see here on the left, the 3 indicators on the map. We really have the ambition to dramatically reduce the share of population in that unfortunate situation, and we were able to reduce that number substantially by 12 million, but then the impact of the crisis meant that 5 million more people actually were in that category of at risk of social exclusion or poverty. The risk of poverty here, you can see this is higher on the edges of Europe, if you will. Doesn't help that we don't have regional data yet for France and Germany. Severe material deprivation is an absolute measure of poverty, and so it makes sense that it's highest in Romania and Bulgaria. Populations and households with very low work intensity is a measure of households where nobody really has been able to work a full-time job in the last 12 months. So you see some staggering differences, notably, for example, in Belgium, the difference between Flanders with a very low rate and Wallonia with a very high rate is quite stark. Migration crisis, we don't mention this as much anymore, but there was a lot of discussion about this. Here we're looking at the population aged 1574 and the share that was born outside the EU, so the non-EU born. We see typically this is a Western European phenomenon, right? You don't really see a lot of non-EU born in Eastern EU. You primarily see them in Germany and France and Spain and Sweden and Ireland, and not so much in the Eastern member states. Changes here primarily focused in cities with a bigger concentration there. We reached over 12% of the population of that age group that was born outside the EU, while in rural areas, it's only 4%, and it didn't grow really over the past 5 years. Other EU born don't follow the same pattern. They are slightly more concentrated in cities, but less pronounced so than the non-EU born, and changes over the past years have been relatively minor. So relatively low, stable numbers of people born in a different EU member state so far. This is a little summary of a paper we put out called Mapping the Glass Ceiling, where we look at how women have been able to achieve a lot compared to women in other regions, and whether women suffer a disadvantage compared to the men in the same region. And then we try and look at the combination. Ideally, you want to be in a high achievement and low disadvantage regions. And those on the map are the right color is green, low disadvantage, high achievement. So you can see actually quite a few regions in France, but also the Benelux, Germany, the Nordics, and Ireland and Spain are in that category, and that's the best place to be. But you can also see in dark red where the regions where women face a lot of disadvantages. So in terms of time, education, safety, work, income, they score less well than the men in the same region. And on top of that, compared to women in other regions, they achieve significantly less. So that's the least favored category there. Encourage you to check out the paper. There are also some online interactive visualizations of the data you want to check out. Looking at life expectancy, there's some good news. We have some of the highest life expectancy in the world, and it's growing. And it's converging. The gaps between the countries with the lowest life expectancy in the Union have been growing faster than the ones where it was already very, very high. So we see a shrinking gap in terms of life expectancy between less developed and more developed regions and member states. But we combine this life expectancy that's high and growing with a very low fertility rate. The last time we had a fertility rate that actually meant we could reproduce the population we have without any migration was in the early 70s, and it was 2.1. Since the last 3 decades, it's been hovering about 1.5, and it's very difficult to actually fundamentally change that fertility rate. So what's the consequence? You get an aging baby boom. The picture on the left is actually a population pyramid, but this is no pyramid. This is more of like a light bulb or a mushroom. And why? It's because the younger cohorts, which are typically larger, here in this case are smaller than the older cohorts. So you get this aging group that moves up that pyramid, and that's why it's top heavy. And the reason it's because it's top heavy, it will lead to more population reductions over time, because you'll have fewer women of childbearing age. So even with higher fertility rates, you're still going to have fewer babies, and fewer babies means a smaller population over time. And that's when, if you look at the impact on a population change, we'll see more and more regions losing population. Right now, about 1/3 of the population lives in a shrinking region. By 2040, that will be half the EU population will be living in a shrinking region. But what I try and emphasize when it comes to population reductions is these reductions might be very small. They might be very slow. You might barely notice them. In dark red, we've put the regions which are really shrinking rapidly, so losing 7.5 per 1,000 people a year over that period. And so that, if you do that for a decade, that's noticeable, excuse me, and will lead to adjustments in the services you offer, in the infrastructure you have, and those adjustments can be quite difficult and quite expensive. So only in the really rapidly shrinking regions do I think you have a real issue there, but here there's a clear urban-rural pattern. If you look at the chart, you see that the urban regions are less likely to have a shrinking population and very less likely to have a very rapidly shrinking population. So here, this is something with a distinct rural character. So these maps show what's going to happen over the next decade in terms of change in those three age groups. So it's 2020 to 2030. And red means reduction. So in terms of young population, they're going to shrink virtually everywhere. Working age population going to shrink pretty much everywhere. And the population 65 and older is going to boom everywhere. I mean, the contrast between these graphs, these maps couldn't be greater. And obviously that has massive consequences in terms of the services we'll need to provide. Likely we'll have to provide more healthcare, probably significantly more healthcare. The dark blue regions will see an increase by 25% in their population over 65. We'll have to reduce or consolidate or adapt the schooling that we offer, and firms will have to find new ways to make their smaller workforce more productive and to make sure that they can continue to grow. So a lot of challenges in these maps. And what I highlight when I do a presentation focused purely on demographics is that to a large degree, this change is already with us. It's embedded in the age structure and it's not something that we can change rapidly. You know, remember that aging baby boom? That's what's driving this process. So, you know, trying to rapidly change migration or encourage return migration or encourage people to have more babies won't fix this. This is really something which is here and we need to start addressing. Looking at trust, Andrés already mentioned it. We've discussed the geography of EU discontent and people voting for anti-EU parties. Here we look at, do people trust the EU? And I've got good news. You know, after the crisis, the economic crisis in 2008, we saw a massive drop-off in the amount of trust in the Union. And now, since the really depth of that fall, that has been slowly increasing in recent years. So trust in the EU has been growing, but we see a very structural pattern that the trust of people living in rural areas is lower than in cities. And so one of the things we are doing now is discussing a long-term vision for rural areas to try and understand why is this lower trust in rural areas so strong and so permanent over time, and how can we show that we're taking their concerns and they're interested at heart, because they also feel that their voices don't count and they're also less likely to participate in elections. So clearly there is some discontent there, and we need to work to understand what that is and show that we're genuine about trying to address those issues. The striking thing is that even though they are less trusting of democratic institutions, with the exception of local and regional authorities, generally they're very satisfied with their life, rural residents. So it's discontent with maybe the prospects or the fear of the future rather than a discontent with their current living conditions, because we see on average rural residents are just as satisfied with their life, with their jobs, with their income, as city residents are. But there is a pattern. In less developed, particularly Eastern member states, we see that rural residents are significantly less satisfied with most of those aspects, whereas city dwellers do better. Whereas in the most developed countries, actually rural residents tend to be more satisfied. One constant is that if you look at city dwellers, they typically have higher incomes, but they're not necessarily more satisfied with their income. Now, two possible explanations: one, they're greedy and they just want more, or the alternative explanation is they pay a lot more on rent. And if you look at the cost of real estate, there is a significant premium for living, especially in the largest city, and as a result, their higher incomes may be needed to pay for higher housing costs. We've also looked at access to services like healthcare, education, but also shops and doctors. And here, typically, rural residents have to travel quite a bit further, and most of them will not be able to use a bike or walking to get to that destination. So there is less of a capacity to switch to a low carbon mode. I mean, in many cities in Europe, we've seen a boom of walking and cycling because people didn't want to drive and didn't want to stay in public transport. And some cities made a big effort to encourage people to ride a bike and make it safer. So in cities, you see a big potential and actually a modal shift, but in rural areas, that's going to be very difficult given that the distances just don't allow for that kind of shift. The demographic change I was talking about earlier will also need to lead to big changes in the location and the amount of services offered in rural areas as the population there continues to age and shrink. But we need to make sure that those increasing distances don't affect the quality of the services they receive. So we'll need to be very creative in making sure that we can still reach those residents in a good manner. Looking at governance, I already highlighted how important this is to us. And this is the latest edition of the European Quality of Government Index 2021. And you see very big differences. So in blue are the regions that score above the EU average, and purple the ones below. And the striking thing is that you also see big differences within countries. You know, the Belgium, but also even Italy, even Slovenia, you see big differences within those countries. The good news is that the ease of doing business, the graph on the bottom left there, shows increases, sometimes substantial increases over between 2016 and 2020. Now, this is an indicator which has been discontinued by the World Bank, so we'll need to find a different way of monitoring how the business environment is evolving, but we're in discussions with them to make sure that we can continue to do this, not just at the national level, but also at the subnational level. And then the top left is a new indicator that we got from the World Justice Project, and it measures rule of law, the quality of the justice system. And there, something which is also confirmed by the European Commission's Rule of Law Project report, that we've seen some deteriorations. And here, the two countries which really stand out with big reductions are both Poland and Hungary, where the Commission is also having a discussion on how to make sure that the rule of law is sufficiently respected. One of the ways we're encouraging countries to improve their institutions is to make them to offer e-government, online services. It's faster, it can be cheaper, there's less potential for corruption, there's no delays, so there's many benefits to this. And we see, you know, a significant increase in the number of people going online to interact with public authorities. But if you look on the left-hand side, there's still very big gaps. You know, in Finland and Sweden, the Netherlands, Denmark, more than 80% of adults have actually interacted with public authorities online. Whereas if you look at, say, Romania, Bulgaria, it's less than 20%. So really, if we want to make sure that all people use this, we still have quite a ways to go. But one of the difficulties is that some people don't know how to use a computer. In the regions on the dark red on the right, more than 30% of the population hasn't used a computer ever. I know that my entire audience here knows how to use a computer, because otherwise they couldn't listen to me. But, you know, so there's a whole group out there that is completely alien or disconnected from these changes. And we need to make sure that they can all also make that transition and make them benefit from these new services. Cohesion policy is we like to think of it as an investment policy. We really try and invest in the long-term structural drivers of competitiveness and of growth. And so we really put a lot of emphasis there on making the right investments and really helping build enough capital stock in regions so that they can compete and they can continue to converge and to grow. Now, if we look at how public investment has changed, you know, we had the big economic crisis in 2008. We really tried to addressed that with a brief increase in spending, but then we very rapidly went into fiscal consolidation, which generally meant that government expenditure had to drop, and in particular, investment tended to drop, because that is maybe easier to do without the public noticing so quickly. But investments are necessary for long-term growth. And since that crisis, public investment has not fully recovered. And so because we have continued with cohesion policy and continued to invest heavily in the Union, and especially in the cohesion countries, that meant that cohesion policy relative to public investment has become much, much more important. If you look at the period 2007-13, the funding combined was the equivalent of about 33%, 34%, I think, of cohesion policy. For the period 2014-2020, this was over 50%. So we provide the equivalent of half of public investment to the cohesion countries. This is a very large amount. And it really means that, A, we help them weather that storm and that crisis, but it also means that they are right now still not able to produce, to fund their investments sufficiently themselves to make sure that they can fully recover and continue to catch up and to grow. And there's another particularity that we show in this report about cohesion countries. Cohesion countries tend to be more centralized, and that means that regional and local authorities tend to spend less. In terms of expenditure, you can see there on the left-hand side, cohesion countries, subnational government expenditure is only about 20% of total government expenditure, whereas in non-cohesion, it's closer to 40%. These things change very slowly over time. They're relatively stable. They're part because of, federal countries obviously have more subnational expenditure, and some countries just have a long tradition of having a lot of local authorities spend a lot of money. But to capture that changing autonomy, we've looked at two indicators. The regional self-rule indicator. It's part of the RAI, Regional Authority Index, Autonomy Index. And we also looked at the Local Authority Index. But we look purely at self-rule, how much can they determine themselves? And also their cohesion countries, both for the regions and the municipalities, offer a lot less freedom to those local and regional authorities than cohesion countries do. So is a challenge for our policy, because we're trying and encourage countries to work at the regional and the local level and allow them to develop their own investment strategy, own development strategy. But it obviously presumes a certain amount of capacity and knowledge of managing such large investments and steering them towards the right goal. So this indicates that we still need to invest more in the capacity of those regional and local authorities to manage such programs. Speaking of programs, looking at cohesion policy here, we've got the main impacts of cohesion policy of the previous period. We provided over 100 euros per person per year in less developed regions, and that really allowed us has allowed them to boost their GDP per capita substantially. We have an economic model that indicates that by 2023, GDP per head in less developed regions will be 2.4% higher than it would be without our policy. It also shows that overall the impact of our policy is positive. Few result indicators there. Cohesion policy in this period will support over 1 million enterprises, will protect 40 million more people from floods, will have improved and constructed rail almost more than 3,000 kilometers, will also improve road infrastructure, improving both accessibility and safety. Remember that traffic safety map. We've helped 36 million participants with labor market integration, and we've improved healthcare. And actually, because of the COVID pandemic and REACT-EU, our allocations to healthcare investments has more than doubled from 10 to 25 billion. So these are really significant numbers, which allow us to really offer improved and new healthcare facilities to such a large population. We've also involved over 3,000 research institutes in cross-border collaborations. So this is what I mentioned earlier. This is our regional economic model. We take the cohesion policy allocations. We look at the impact by 2023. We see big growth impacts, both because of the expenditure occurring during the implementation period in 2023. By 2043, we see a lower impact, but that's a sustained impact. And here we're benefiting not of the expenditure effect, but really the structural enhancements that we've made to those economies, lifting them up to a higher level. And in that medium run, we expect actually the cohesion policy to have a positive impact on all member states, because actually it generates a positive sum game for the union as a whole. So, talked a little bit long, but I'm almost done. So, what's the conclusion of 330 pages? It's hard to say, but the big message is we've seen quite some improvements in cohesion. There's definitely good news, but some of the disparities are still there, and some have grown. And so we're very concerned about this problem of development traps. It tends to affect middle income regions, but not only. We also see it in some less developed and even some more developed regions. So we really need to think more about how we can address this by improving education, innovation, and in particular governance. The green and digital transition will require massive investments. I mentioned the need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but we're concerned that it might particularly affect less developed regions and rural areas, and we have to find a good way to deal with that. Demographic change, again, this will affect all regions, but some earlier than others, so we need to think about how do we manage that whole process, because this is the goal of cohesion, is that we manage change in such a way that we don't leave anybody behind. And so we now are launching a debate. We'll have the Cohesion Forum in a month's time, and they will be discussing how we can address potential new drivers of disparities, looking in particular at the twin transition, green and digital, demographic change, strengthening the role of regions in building Europe's future. Think about how can we make sure that they have the funding and the capacity to really make an important contribution to well-being and growth in their regions, and how can we make sure that they all manage to become more innovative. Think about that growing innovation divide, and also we need to address the needs of the left behind places, and I'm sure this is a phrase that Andrés will recognize. And then last, we were thinking more about what kind of tools do we want to use for that? How can we improve a place-based policy such as cohesion policy, but how can we also make sure that other EU policy do no harm to cohesion? So lots of things to debate. Okay, with that, thank you for listening to me, and I'll happily try to answer your questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Lewis, and thank you for actually going over a report, going over the reality and the diversity of regional Europe in about an hour, and also for presenting in a very realistic and challenging way all the challenges that we have. There are quite a few questions coming thick and fast. So without further ado, because I know time is of essence and we got just half an hour, I'm going to ask the people, and they come from different topics. So I'm going to ask the people that have asked the questions to unmute themselves. And the first question is from Alexandra Bogdanov, who is here at the LSE, and is about planes and trains. So please, Alexandra, can you ask the question?
Yeah, hello, thanks for the discussion. It was really interesting. Yes, you mentioned indeed that speed was really important in order for trains to compete with planes. And you also said that, for instance, like transporter cooperation is complicated in that matter. And it makes me think about the train within the Alps between France and Italy. And so my question is, what is the place that you think should night trains have in that broader system? Because it's not something that you've talked about. Should the EU have a generalized plan for that?
Thank you for that question. I actually remember night trains. That's starting to show my age here, but the question between rail and air is quite complicated. And one of the key things is price. Right now, I can buy a 20 euro ticket flight to Milan. I will never be able to buy a train ticket for 20 euro to Milan. So the price is really a big important aspect there. But I think the key question for the future is how are we going to integrate air into the emissions trading system? How are we going to make sure that they reduce carbon emissions? There's even basic equity issues that, you know, if I take a bus to Milan, the gasoline, the fuel I use will be taxed. If I take an airplane to Milan, it will barely be taxed. So there's really many inequities built into the system that really give air a much stronger advantage compared to road or rail right now. So I think over time we need to address those issues, and the key question will be, you know, how much will emissions start to cost? How much do they need to cost to make sure that we can reduce them rapidly enough to avoid more than a 2-degree increase? So that's a long way of saying is, I think there can be a room for night trains, but I think the demand really needs to be there, and us providing them and then just having them roam around Europe at night empty is also not doing the planet any good. So for me, I think it's part of the answer, but the first step we need to take is to make sure that we're pricing air flights in the appropriate manner. This is a slow process, and there's still lots of discussion going on that. But I think once we are seeing more realistic prices for air that really integrate their externalities, I think night trains will become a much stronger and more attractive option in the future than they are today.
There are a lot of questions coming through at the moment, so if
I'll try to be
you
short.
can keep the answers short and the questions short. So next is Vicente Royuela from the University of Barcelona. Please, Vicente.
Thank you very much for the very nice presentation and the fantastic work, which is for sure will devote a lot of time for read. Yes, my question has to do with inequality, and you presented some maps about poverty, etc. I don't know if you provided also some inequality maps or not. Maybe many times it's tough just to get the right data, just to provide good inequality indices. But at least at the national country could be derived some sort of, I don't know, urban inequality versus rural inequality, because many times the changes in inequality are taking place within cities, and my fear is that this urban expansion, it's also implying some increase in urban inequality. I don't know if you have the chance just to look at this data and what are the outcomes of this, and if you can compare it with the between regions spatial inequalities. Thank you.
Very good question. I didn't show them in my presentation, but in the report, we've looked at both the level of at-risk of poverty rate by degree of urbanization and their changes over time. And we've looked both country by country and aggregated to groups. And we've actually seen a big reduction, particularly in rural areas of inequality. But this groups the entire country in 3 classes. So we don't have the data to look within individual cities, but we can look at in the cities as a whole and rural areas as a whole. And actually there we actually see in quite a few countries big improvements in the rural areas.
Thank you very much. Now we're going to our own Simone Marino, who is also a member of the board of the center here. So Simone, please, the floor is yours.
Andrés, hello.
Yes, I hear you.
I put the question and I thought you were going to read it for brevity. But anyway, Lewis, fantastic as usual, really, really clear, conveying a huge amount of material in very, very short time, very clearly, fantastic. Just a remark more than anything else, female disadvantage and achievement. Neither a regional nor a EU South story, as far as I see, in the case of Italy in particular. What is your short interpretation? Thank you.
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, my main, I mean, one of the things that really struck me about this work is we've been looking at women in elected political positions. And we've looked at over the past decade and we see some improvements, right? But we're still stuck at 1/3. And we have found regions where not a single woman is in a regional council or in a municipal council. And I find that this day and age really shocking. So I think we need to really make a massive effort to make sure that they can excel, they can thrive, they can, you know, develop their talents, including in politics. there's two very different ways that they've promoted women in elected positions. One is the kind of controversial quotas, and they suggest half of the women on your list, half of the people on your list need to be women. But there's the other way of saying, well, the right thing to do is to make sure that we have enough women on our list. So there are different ways of getting there, but I definitely think it's very important. Obviously, if you have a nationwide requirement that every list needs to be 50% female, you'll see a very uniform pattern, of course, in the results. So there's a couple of countries where that is the case. So that's why you may not get such a strong regional story there. But I think it's very important that we keep addressing this, and particularly we see the gap is biggest in terms of employment for less educated women. So there's still a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. So now we go to the environment, and we got Teodora Dogaru from Romania and the Netherlands. So Teodora, if you can ask the question. Well, if she's not around or she's not replying, so I'll ask the question myself then in that respect.
She's trying to talk, but she has a microphone issue.
Oh, so Teodora, if you can unmute yourself. Thanks, Alexandra. All right, we'll go to the next question, Teodora, and then we can come back to you in the next one. So then there's Victor Per Sanchez. If you can unmute yourself and ask the question, please.
Yeah, hello, thank you. I hope you hear me well. Thank you for your wonderful presentation. Yeah, my question was more about the unit of analysis you use in the study, because, for example, in the case of Spain, for the different variables, you use different unit of analysis. For example, I was looking at the infrastructure or the population, aging population, and you look at the provincial level, whereas in other variables, especially the economic variables, you use the communities, the larger regions. I don't know if this has a difficult interpretation or can lead to wrong conclusions, especially for this cohesion funding or whatever. Maybe there are huge differences inside regions. It was just that remark.
Thank you, Victor. I think that's a very pertinent question. I'm a self-aware data nerd and I love high resolution data. So whenever I can get higher resolution data, I am happy, because if I have high resolution data, I can aggregate it up to whatever level I need it at. I like looking at the provincial level because it's better at capturing urban-rural differences and metropolitan differences. But for many indicators, we're stuck at NUTS 2. So there it's difficult to get that same data for a finer geography. So it is an issue, but we are increasingly working at NUTS 3. We get more data at NUTS 3, in particular for issues like transport and demography. I think that's an important aspect to look at. But for the more, difficult indicators to get at that scale, we are unfortunately stuck at NUTS 2. So it's something we take into account, but it's comes with the kind of data constraints we have to work with. So it's an issue you have to be aware of when you're doing the analysis and the interpretation.
Thank you. And now we go from the LSE again to another participant at the LSE. So Ahmed Ali, if you can unmute yourself. And this one is about e-government, which I think is a fundamental issue.
Yeah, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. My question is related to e-government aspect, as you mentioned. How much time frame do you think it's going to take to establish substantially in EU when more than 30%, as you mentioned, don't know how to use computers? And mostly, I don't know what is the number do you have for that most of the applications, social applications being used by the population, just like WhatsApp for messaging purpose. And besides, you also mentioned about the bandwidth challenges in rural areas that we have. Thank you.
Ahmed, great questions. Yes, there are regions where more than 30% has never used a computer, and those are massive challenges. The reason I bring it up is because when we're trying to make that digital transition, the challenges we face aren't only in terms of infrastructure or technology, it's also about skills. So if we really want to make that digital transition, we need to help these people, teach them how to use a computer and make it interesting and attractive for them to learn how to use those machines. And so this is for me a key, digital inclusion aspect of our work. So I think it's very important. But I'm actually relatively optimistic. I mean, if we, I can actually remember the days before the internet. Yes, I'm that old. So, given that that's my age, I've actually seen massive changes, right? And I'm optimistic that this can go very rapidly. And basically what we're saying as a union, we're committed to making sure that this digital transition reaches every territory. We're not going to leave somebody behind, and we're going to make sure that you can access those kind of services, and we'll help you figure out how to make them work for you.
Well, now we got a challenging question because it's one that has been posted on Twitter by Patrick Bishari in recent weeks, and I don't think that he has received any replies. So, Patrick, the floor is yours on that.
Thank you very much, Andrés, and also congratulations for the great report. We used to have very nice cohesion reports. The question is quite difficult, as you say, because when we analyzed in a recent article the GDP per capita growth over the long term since 1996, because before the data are not that strong, let's say, we could not find any example of a former industrial region that declined and then rebounded durably. I'm from Wallonia in Belgium, so you understand that we could be very interested in having some good practice, good example to follow, and but we haven't found such a good rebound example. That even despite cohesion support, as you mentioned, there was this development trap, and especially for the regions that are supported and that are in transition, as it is said. And I was wondering whether on top of Pittsburgh that was mentioned in the US, there were maybe some good examples, especially at the TL2 level. Thank you.
Merci, Patrick. I don't live too far from Wallonia, so I get the urgency. The Belgian press also picked up on the issue of the development trap, and we've had discussion with journalists on that front. Off the top of my head, we only looked at since 2000, so I can't give you an answer of like, look at this region. I do want to share with you that it's very difficult to overcome deindustrialization, because it really requires many different changes, and changes that sometimes take a very long time to take effect. If you're moving from a region where people were used to find a very well-paying job, even if they didn't have a very high level of education, where there was one very large employer that offered lots of people a job. I mean, it also means a relatively low entrepreneurship level, very few people who actually take the risk of setting up their own company, and much less need to be retrained or learn new skills. So when an employer like that collapses or leaves a region, it leaves a massive hole behind. And to expect to be able to overcome such a big gap in a very short period of time, and unfortunately 10, maybe even 20 years is still a relatively short period of time, is maybe a bit ambitious. But obviously, Andrés and I have been looking at the consequences of long-term economic decline, and they're very real. So it's not an issue that, I don't think it's impossible to do, but it really does require a very long-term commitment. And we're trying to understand what elements you need to get right to be able to, you can get out of such a development trap. And I think the deindustrialized regions are facing the biggest challenge on that front. So I think it's an important question. We are working also with the JRC to create longer time series of GDP per capita in a database we call Ardeco. And there you can actually find also sectoral data on employment and GVA. And so that might be helpful in trying to find a success story among the many regions here in Europe.
So I know I shouldn't wait in, but you might also want to take a look at regions that have had a strong industrial change, but have not been in a development trap. And you can look perhaps into the case of the Basque Country in Spain and Småland in Sweden, for example, as examples of change. Let me try to go back to Teodora. Teodora, can you try to wade in? If not,
good evening. I don't know if you hear me now.
We can hear you very well, so please go
brilliant. Ahead. Sorry about that earlier. Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. Very interesting. A lot of things to think about. I was just wondering about what you were saying about the carbon emissions, and I've seen some interesting countries there that achieved their targeted values, and it was quite a surprise for me. I was just wondering if those countries benefited from, for instance, advantages from having key elements of the value chain, or having some kind of manufacturing plants there. So is this a location advantage, or was it policy?
Oh, that's an excellent question, Teodora. I will struggle to give a comprehensive answer, but let me start with a little bit of context. The greenhouse gas emissions are, we measure them at source, but the benefits of those emissions obviously accrue to many different people, and so and many different regions, and in some cases different countries. Electricity production can happen in one country and then go to another country where they benefit from that electricity without having the emissions allocated. Also, I'm not a big fan of indicators like greenhouse gas intensity or greenhouse gas per GDP per capita, because again, it might just reflect the industrial structure. So changes in greenhouse gas emissions reflect all of that, and some of them will have lower greenhouse gas emissions because they had the benefit of a large car manufacturer moving out, or a large cement factory closing up business. So there is definitely policy in those numbers, but there's also a lot of noise in those numbers. And the thing that we are looking at now is really to increase the amount of policy in those numbers to also improve those numbers. So increasingly we're looking at, okay, sector by sector, how can we achieve this transition? And the Commission just came out with a whole package focus on the renovation of building stocks, because by 2030, most of the buildings that are going to be there in 2030 are already here today. So it's not about a standard for new buildings. It's about how do we move all the buildings we have and want to keep to a higher efficiency standard. And the difficulty with, say, industry and energy production is that's much more complicated, and it's not as straightforward, which means also that we're very dependent on seeing where these price signals are sufficient to really shift those sectors to a more efficient production system. But it's unclear to what extent that will have spatial ramifications. It might be that we replace, a coal plant with another electricity producing plant in the same location, or that we build, renewable energy production somewhere else. It really depends on, say, the geographic characteristics, the needs, and the opportunities for producing more renewable energy. So it's a long answer, and I don't think what we see there is primarily driven by policy, but if we want to make our policy a success, we're going to have to drive that a lot harder.
Okay, so we are almost coming to the end, but I cannot resist using my prerogative as chairman of this session to ask you a question. Not a question that I find particularly difficult, but it's going to put you on the spot because it's possibly politically sensitive. We are in the fortunate situation that in a period of 2 weeks, we have had a lot of developments in regional development, if you want. First, the United Kingdom published the white paper for, in, let's say, Westminster jargon, to level up the country. And then 1 week, barely 1 week later, the European Commission published a cohesion report. I know that you've been half Dutch, half British. You're a keen follower, and you were before, as per your job, of unequal development in the UK. So the UK has substituted European regional development policy for something that is called leveling up and this white paper. Do you think that they're going to be better off, or that a country that has witnessed a significant increase in inequality in recent decades is going to continue down that road?
Yeah, good question, Andrés, and a question very close to my heart. So it's one I have been pondering a lot. Let me split it up in two parts. I don't think the Union or the UK benefited from Brexit. I think it leaves both of us worse off, and I regret that it has happened, and I hope that we can find ways of working more closely together in the future. So I also think that the impact of Brexit is somewhat asymmetric. If you have a small economy, which the UK is, may not think of it as small, but if you have a small economy leaving the largest single market in the world, obviously they're going to suffer more of all the trade restrictions they wanted to raise. So economically, I think Brexit was not a smart idea, and I think the vast majority of economists are going to agree with me there. If I look at their proposals for leveling up, I'm conflicted. On the one hand, I find the ambitions laudatory. I think it's well written. I think it addresses some of the key issues. But of course, when it comes to the way cohesion policy treats those same issues, I think we're looking at a very different approach. One of the main differences is that we work with very large, stable, long-term funding schemes. We ask regions to develop a development strategy, an investment strategy that they implement over a period of 10 years with stable, guaranteed funding. That really gives you the kind of solid opportunity to really make the most of that. And the other aspect is the UK, especially England, is still relatively centralized. And if you want to level up, if you want to make sure that the cities and regions can manage such a large investment package and strategy, I think we also need to think beyond the various city deals and really look at a stable, ideally regional structure that can manage regional development strategies. And I don't see that in there. So I see a lot of ambition, laudatory objectives I would share, but the institutional and financial underpinnings of their proposal are not substantial enough to give me the confidence that this will really make a significant impact over the next decade. This may change. It might be, the first impetus to get us there, but we'll need a lot more to make sure that I think the north of England feels that they are heard and understood, and they see convergence with the rest of the UK.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for a very informative, challenging, and entertaining session. It's a pity that we couldn't have you here in person with us, but the advantage of having a webinar is that people from all over Europe have managed to actually participate and ask questions directly. But we look forward to seeing you in London as soon as possible, as soon as your schedule and the pandemic, of course, allows. And I'm going to ask everyone just to unmute your microphones, turn on your cameras, and give a strong round of applause to Lewis for his participation and also for his contribution to our increasing the knowledge and challenging us to pursue more research on regional development. Thank you very much.